Doesn't seem like a lot of people know the difference between watercolor and gouache, so I wanted to make a video that shows how watercolor works versus how gouache works. So first of all, watercolor is a transparent paint and it is dilutable with water, and its binder is gum arabic, which is a rather weak binder. As a result, watercolor doesn't have a natural sealer in it like acrylic or oil. When they dry, they're waterproof, and watercolor obviously is not. So you can see it's transparent and luminous and very lovely. Gouache is also a water-soluble paint. So the first comparison is that watercolor is transparent and luminous, and gouache, because of the zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, is opaque and duller and more matte looking, more of a velvety finish. So you can see that I'm using sort of the same thickness of gouache on the right side there, and it is not luminous and transparent looking like the watercolor on the left. It's just a bit more sort of chalky looking and a bit more dull. If you want to go really dark with watercolor or with gouache, the trick is just to, of course, layer. So you can layer watercolor and layer gouache, and you have to wait till watercolor layers are dry before you go to the next layer, unless you want the colors to mix. And with gouache, the drying time is actually pretty instant. So the big thing with watercolor is you really have to love the luminosity of it and the diverse effects you can get with it. When it comes to the different mediums, watercolor really is the most luminous and beautiful, and nothing else can really capture that sort of light quality of transparent colors a watercolor can. You can drop water back into a painted area and you'll get these blooms and this great effect. You can get all these great watercolor textures and water effects from how the water dries around the paint and in the paint and how the colors mingle together. And you can add other things to it to increase the effects, like salt or sand and, sponging, all sorts of things like that. With gouache, it actually is more limited than that, because if you thinned it down to the point of it being transparent, then why aren't you just using watercolor? So if you're going to be using gouache the way gouache is meant to be used, which is a little bit thicker, gouache has that chalkiness in it because of the titanium dioxide, and so it will not budge as much. You can still do sort of blurred effects and impressionist effects by doing loose brush strokes, but it's very much like acrylic and oil in that sense, is that you can do an impressionist painting or you can do a more realistic painting, but you can't really do water effects or textures the way that you do with watercolor. When it comes to white in watercolor and gouache, both mediums treat it differently. So for example, if I wanted to have a circular brown shape here and save the middle as white, I need to make sure I save the white of the paper if it's watercolor. If I was to dip into some white paint, then what's going to happen is my watercolor is going to turn into gouache. So if I want to maintain the transparent luminosity of watercolor, I need to make sure I save the white of the paper and paint around any white highlights. I can also lift out certain amounts of paint on other parts of my paper. So if I have a highlight that I want to lift out because I forgot to save it, or because I prefer a blurred edge, sometimes it gives you a nice softer blurred edge if you lift out rather than saving the white, then you just have to lift out with a brush, just a damp brush with water, and then dab out with a paper towel or a chamois or a washcloth, and you'll end up saving some of that white and it'll come back. But I can't use white paint, so watercolor has no white paint. That's the rule. For gouache, you have the white paint because gouache is constantly using the white paint. It's what's giving it its body. So if you want a pure white area, you don't have to save it. You can just go back onto any part of your gouache painting and add white, or you can save the white of your painting and then come back on there with more white. With gouache, it doesn't matter. You can add light, you can add dark, and both will work just fine. So you don't really see any of your paper when you're painting in gouache, whereas with watercolor, you see a lot of the paper, and when you're seeing white, you're actually seeing the white of the paper. There's also a difference in the two mediums when it comes to glazing. So with watercolor, you can add glazes as long as your underlayer is completely dry. You can add a top color glaze in any color, and it will make the entire color tone shift towards whatever you want, in this case, this dark blue-green. And you cannot do that with gouache, even though you can do this with acrylic and oil because they dry completely between layers. The paint in watercolor sort of sinks into the paper. With gouache, it's more sitting on top of the paper. So when you go to add a glaze to gouache, it just smears that entire white. Gouache paint is thicker in general than watercolor, and as a result of that, you really can't add a glaze over the top of it because the water will make the entire shape smear. So you can't really do that with gouache, but you can do that with watercolor. I'm also going to show you a quick example of how gouache and watercolor lift off. So you can see there's some very ugly leafy sort of shapes. I really don't know what they are actually, but keep in mind that that ugly leaf shape is an ink, so it's not going to lift off. What I'm trying to show is the rest of the colors on top lifting off. So you can see the watercolor does lift off very well, and the gouache also lifts off very well. The only other thing I should point out is that if you're trying to cover up a mistake in watercolor, say I wanted to cover up that ugly ink leaf, with watercolor it would be almost impossible. If I wanted to cover up that ugly ink leaf on the gouache side, however, I could just use the opaque gouache paint to cover it up and I could hide it pretty well. I'm just going to also now do a quick sphere in watercolor and gouache. You can spend a lot more time on this and do far more layers, and depending on what you're going for, more layers might look better to you or less layers might look better to you. Either way, you can see how I've applied the different principles of watercolor and of gouache for the different spheres, how I've saved white for the watercolor sphere and how I have just painted white on top for the gouache sphere, and also how I've waited for layers to dry in between for the watercolor and how I don't really have to do that for the gouache. And you can again keep making a comparison between the watercolor and gouache and how they look. I'm going to be doing another video very soon after this one that does a more sort of in-depth project that is a watercolor versus gouache project. So I hope this is helpful to you and that you enjoy the next video as well.